The sky over Los Angeles held grayish tones that afternoon, with heavy clouds gathering above the glass-covered buildings downtown. Caleb left the conference carrying a dark leather briefcase in one hand, still reflecting on the data presented by investors and analysts. He didn't usually drift into thoughts outside the corporate world, but something about that afternoon weighed on his shoulders with a strange heaviness. The concrete beneath his feet vibrated with the city's bustle. Car horns blared in the distance, and people rushed in all directions, like pieces on a giant, constantly shifting board. Caleb crossed the sidewalk, mechanically dodging pedestrians, until his gaze drifted across the street. It was in that instant that everything seemed to slow down. The sounds of cars and footsteps seemed to dissolve into the background, replaced by an internal silence that took over his mind. His eyes locked onto a young woman crossing the street at the crosswalk. Around her, 4 children walked briskly, 2 on each side. The contrast between the simplicity of that scene and the internal storm it stirred in Caleb was immediate and inexplicable. The children's features struck him like a blow to the chest. They didn't just resemble someone. They looked exactly like him, like living copies of what he once looked like as a child. The hair, the eyes, the shape of the face, even the way one of them furrowed their brow while looking at traffic. It all seemed taken from old photos his mother had once kept in forgotten albums. Caleb stood still, as if his body had temporarily disconnected from reality. The light turned green for the cars, and people bumped into him as they passed. But he didn't react. His attention was completely captured by that woman and those children. His heart began to beat unevenly, something rare for someone used to maintaining control in front of the country's top investors. Amid that urban chaos, an enigma had emerged and struck him hard. Those children seemed to carry on their faces traits he only saw in the mirror and in his oldest memories. Driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, Caleb crossed the street after them. There was no logic in his gesture, only an instinctive need not to lose sight of those figures. He watched from a distance as the woman stopped on the opposite sidewalk, adjusted one of the girls' backpacks, and crouched down to wipe another's face. She looked exhausted, yet there was a steady grace about her, a kind of calm that stood in stark contrast to the rush of the surrounding city. The children spoke to one another, lightly tugging each other's arms, while she kept her eyes on all 4 with a divided yet loving focus. Caleb tried to approach discreetly, but one of the boys noticed his presence and pointed at him. The woman quickly lifted her gaze and stared at him for a few seconds. There was no hesitation in her eyes, nor surprise, only a brief recognition, as if she already knew this moment would come. Then, she firmly took the children's hands and began walking in the opposite direction. That reaction only deepened Caleb's confusion, and he quickened his steps, determined to understand what was happening. He reached the group a few steps later and stood in front of them, saying nothing, just trying to decipher the woman's face and the 4 little ones. She held her posture firm, showing neither fear nor discomfort. Her expression carried an unsettling clarity, as if she anticipated exactly what he was feeling. Without lowering her gaze, she simply spoke a sentence that echoed like thunder inside Caleb, shattering any possibility of coincidence or doubt. Those children were his. And before he could articulate any reaction, she took the children by the hand and began walking away with decisive steps, leaving him standing in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by cars, sounds, and people, yet completely engulfed in an inner silence that swallowed him whole. Caleb didn't move right away. The revelation made no logical sense in his mind. He had never had children, never been involved with that woman, at least not in any way that could have created a family. The timelines didn't match. The scenarios didn't align, except for a distant memory, stored in a forgotten corner of his youth, a memory from the time he lived in Shanghai, many years ago. Back then, still in his idealistic and carefree phase, he had accepted an unusual request from a medical lab to donate genetic material to an international fertility bank, with promises of absolute anonymity and confidentiality. It was supposed to be technical, detached, a gesture almost scientific in nature. Now, standing in the center of a city where everything seemed to have order and control, he was confronted with the human consequences of that distant act. 4 children. 4. And all with his face. The impact of that revelation spread through his mind like cracks in glass. Rationality, his greatest weapon in business and in life, was beginning to give way to an uncomfortable mix of emotions he couldn't even name. There was a flicker of recognition, a flash of belonging, maybe even an old fear of something he never imagined facing. The flow of people around him returned to its usual rhythm, and the city began to pulse as it always had. But for Caleb, everything had changed. He knew he couldn't just leave this behind. Something inside him had already shifted. That woman and those children had broken an invisible barrier, and he felt that he needed to understand what had truly happened, not just on a biological level, but in the very essence of what it all meant. His past, his choices, his concept of family, of responsibility, everything was about to be re-examined. Without any further hesitation, Caleb began walking in the same direction Brooke had gone. This wasn't an impulsive chase, but an inevitable movement, as if something greater than himself was guiding his steps. The city, once so familiar, now seemed to hold mysteries he had never noticed, and at the heart of that mystery were 4 children who carried his face, and a woman who claimed they were his children. Caleb quickened his pace, determined not to lose sight of Brooke. He crossed streets, ignored traffic signals, and followed the movements of the woman who walked with steady determination among the crowd, always keeping close watch over the 4 little ones around her. The city's noise seemed to return to his ears, but everything still sounded muffled, as if a veil separated him from the real world. Every step brought him closer to something he couldn't yet name, but already recognized as inevitable. The ground beneath his feet felt less stable, as if the certainties that had always supported him were giving way to a force that no longer depended on his will. He caught up to her just as she was about to turn onto a side street, seemingly trying to escape the denser part of the crowd. Her gesture was subtle, but intentional. Brooke didn't want to be followed, and that was clear in the way she cast a quick glance over her shoulder. Still, Caleb didn't hesitate. He came close enough for her to clearly notice him. His presence caused immediate tension. Brooke's body stiffened. Her shoulders tightened slightly, and her eyes scanned quickly for an escape route, though the children required her constant attention. Even so, she didn't run, didn't scream, didn't back away. She paused for a few moments, adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and faced Caleb with a look that mixed exhaustion and clarity. In that brief moment, between the noise of cars and hurried footsteps of passers-by, something silent happened. It wasn't a conversation, but a collision of truths. Caleb was there, not as a businessman searching for rational answers, but as a man confronted with a revelation that threatened his understanding of the world. He didn't know exactly what he expected to hear, but inside him remained the hope that it was all just an absurd coincidence. However, Brooke's posture shattered that illusion. She didn't seem surprised by the confrontation. In fact, she appeared prepared, as if she had always known this moment would come. There was firmness in her expression, and her response, though silent at first, was clear in her attitude. Calmly, she looked at the children, then at Caleb, and confirmed without hesitation what he most feared to accept. Those children were indeed the result of his anonymous donation. Brooke didn't need to explain how she knew. The certainty in her eyes made explanations unnecessary. There was no room for questions. She didn't try to justify, nor did she attempt to soften the truth. Her answer was a turning point, direct, calm, and final. And then, with the same composure with which she had stated the truth, she began to walk away, as if she knew the responsibility of dealing with that now belonged to him. Caleb stood still for a few seconds. The world around him resumed its motion, and the sounds returned to their place. But inside, he felt something had broken. It wasn't pain exactly. It was more like a sudden misalignment, as if he had stumbled upon something buried deep within himself. What he had just witnessed wasn't merely the revelation of an unexpected truth, but the beginning of a process that could no longer be stopped. The children, who once seemed like shadows of the past, were now living realities walking beside a woman who had the courage to raise them without expecting anything in return. And Caleb, as confused as he was, understood in that moment that he had been called to something bigger than his controlled routine. As he watched Brooke and the children disappear among the crowd, he realized what had just happened wasn't an ending, but a calling. That woman hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't begged, cried, or accused. She simply stated a truth and moved on, carrying 4 lives that resembled him more than any mirror ever had. And it was precisely that lack of appeal that shook him. because Brooke wasn't seeking acknowledgement. She didn't demand reparations. She didn't show resentment. She simply carried on with the children she had raised, determined to protect them from the impact his presence might bring. And in that silent departure, Caleb understood that something inside him had been irreversibly touched. This wasn't just curiosity. It was the beginning of a transformation he hadn't planned, but that now led him down paths where logic and control no longer held power. Caleb couldn't return to his routine after that encounter. His body remained in motion, attending meetings, walking through hallways and boardrooms, but his mind stayed fixated on the image of Brooke and the 4 children crossing the street. The children's faces continued to appear vividly, framed by memories of his own childhood. The symmetry was unsettling. It wasn't just a vague impression or a resemblance forced by emotion. There was something genuine, almost scientific, in the way the features repeated themselves, as if time had folded and presented him with smaller versions of himself. No matter how hard he tried to rationalize, he couldn't find explanations strong enough to push away the urgency he felt to understand. The urge began as a silent, almost compulsive search for answers. Caleb combed through his own memories with an intensity he hadn't practiced in years. He revisited every phase of his youth, trying to identify some point of connection, some lapse, some moment that could justify the origin of those familiar faces. It wasn't possible to accept such precise coincidence. He revisited the period when he had lived in China during an exchange program more than a decade ago. It was a time he had kept stored as a collection of curious, forgettable experiences, now suddenly given unexpected weight. As he delved deeper into this personal investigation, one specific memory resurfaced, a decision made during a detached moment when he anonymously donated genetic material to a local fertility program. He remembered the hospital, the cold room, the form filled out with generic information. At the time, it had held no significance in his life. It was just another impulsive gesture from someone going through a phase of discovery in another country. But now, the memory loomed with a new weight, and with it came the conviction that this seemingly insignificant choice may have become something profoundly real. Caleb wasn't satisfied with just remembering. He hired a private investigator, not out of distrust in Brooke, but out of a need to validate what his mind still resisted accepting. He needed more than clues. He needed confirmation. Every detail that emerged about her life strengthened the possibility he was beginning to admit. Brooke had lived in Shanghai during the years following his exchange program. She had been married to an American man who struggled with infertility. The couple had sought out local clinics specializing in assisted reproduction, and from that point on, the coincidences turned into evidence. Even with all these discoveries, Caleb still couldn't fully grasp what it all meant. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but not in a way that caused panic. Instead, it awakened a deep, almost instinctive curiosity. It wasn't just the biological fatherhood calling him, but the possibility of having a role in those children's lives. Something inside him, something that had always remained dormant, was beginning to stir. It was a silent calling from a place within himself he hadn't known until then. As the days passed, he couldn't keep his distance. He found ways to be in the same places Brooke frequented, not out of obsession, but from a genuine need to observe her with the children. He wanted to understand how she lived, how she raised them, how she managed to smile while clearly carrying the weight of so many responsibilities. And the more he saw, the more certain he became that this woman was strong, honest, and determined. There was no room for opportunism or manipulation. She hadn't looked for him, hadn't exposed him, hadn't tried to benefit from anything. She raised the children with dignity, love, and strength, without ever involving his name or image in that reality. That realization intensified the internal impact Caleb was experiencing. His persistence was no longer a search for logic, but an attempt to find his own place within a truth he could no longer ignore. He didn't know what to do, but he knew he needed to get closer. Not to control or claim, but to take responsibility. He was beginning to understand that he had reached a point where he could no longer remain a spectator in his own story. The children existed. They had faces, names, laughs, and he, no matter how much he tried to maintain the comfortable distance of probabilities, was now part of that narrative. What now moved him wasn't the shock of the discovery, but the awareness that he was face to face with a direct link to the humanity he had spent years trying to avoid. The structures that had supported him through adult life, success, control, emotional independence, were beginning to collapse in the face of the simple truth being laid bare. He was a father. Biologically, undeniably, unexpectedly. And those children, with their bright eyes and spontaneous gestures, carried not just his blood, but also the chance for something he had never sought, a real connection. The approach between Caleb and Brooke didn't happen abruptly, but rather as a gradual process, built by the silent weight of the truth surrounding them. He didn't demand immediate answers, nor did he force situations. He simply made himself present, observed with respect, and showed an interest born from the understanding that something far greater than any impulse or curiosity was at stake. Brooke noticed his constant presence, but didn't interpret it as a threat. There was an almost uncomfortable restraint in Caleb's gestures, as if he himself was learning how to deal with emotions he had never allowed to grow. And maybe it was that contrast, between the powerful figure everyone knew and the man now emerging, without defenses, that led her to lower a bit of the shield she had always kept around her story. Brooke never sought compassion. She learned to live with her own silences, to turn fragility into discipline, and when she finally decided to share part of what she had lived through, she did it without drama or regret. With the same firmness she used to declare that the children were his, she began to reveal the layers of a path marked by difficult choices and moments of utter solitude. She explained that she lived in Shanghai for a few years, accompanying her then-husband on a work assignment that lasted longer than they had anticipated. The move to China initially represented an adventure, a chance to start over in a new place, to reinvent their routine, and maybe strengthen a relationship that already showed signs of wear. However, the promise of stability slowly faded as the challenges piled up. The marriage, sustained by appearances and mechanical coexistence, began to fall apart when the desire to have children became a priority. There were months of failed attempts, invasive tests, and back-and-forth trips to fertility clinics. The diagnosis hit like a blow: irreversible male infertility. Her ex-husband, overcome with frustration, began to distance himself emotionally. He tried to compensate for the pain with control, coldness, and denial. Brooke, on the other hand, didn't give up. She wanted to be a mother not out of whim, but because she felt she could still build something of her own, something that didn't rely on someone else's instability. When the option of in vitro fertilization was presented, she embraced the idea with quiet courage. She searched for sperm donors at local clinics. There were many options, but one stood out: a genetic profile of American origin, compatible with her own background, described discreetly, without excessive details, but with a few basic pieces of information: blood type, education level, absence of hereditary diseases. There was also an old, nearly faded photo of the donor as a teenager. The image stirred in her a strange sense of familiarity, as if she already knew that face. At the time, she had no idea that this visual connection was actually the prelude to something much bigger. The process unfolded clinically and objectively. The sessions, the hormones, the waiting, the tests, everything was handled with near military discipline. Brooke didn't tell anyone about her choice. She was alone in another country, far from family, without support from a husband who was growing more distant each day. When she found out she was pregnant, she cried in silence. Not out of fear, but out of relief. For the first time in a long while, she felt something growing inside her that didn't depend on someone else's instability. Months later, she gave birth to 4 babies. Yes, 4. The medical team was surprised by the outcome of the pregnancy. But for Brooke, who had faced it all with such commitment, the multiplicity felt like a sign of abundance, not a challenge. She raised the children with complete dedication. When she returned to the United States, already divorced, she didn't seek any outside assistance. She started over from scratch, building a new life with the resources she had. She worked 2 jobs, organized her routine with precision, taught the children to respect the world and to respect themselves. She never told anyone about the donor, never tried to find him, sue him, or involve anyone else. For her, motherhood was a unilateral choice, made freely, with full responsibility. And she continued that way, until the day Caleb appeared on that sidewalk, watching her children as if seeing his own reflection crossing the street. Now, Seeing in his eyes not judgment, but sincere bewilderment, she decided to let him know, not to gain anything in return, but so the truth would be complete. Caleb listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail as if every word opened another door to a past he hadn't known he had lived. And there, in the midst of that quiet revelation, a bond formed between them, silent, invisible, but definitive. The impact of Brooke's words spread through Caleb like a silent electric current. It didn't cause alarm, but it changed everything inside. As she recounted each step of her journey, something stirred in the forgotten corners of his memory, awakening recollections long buried beneath the fast-paced routine of his professional life. For many years, Caleb had lived practically, distanced from sentimentality, focused on building a solid image in the financial world and maintaining strict control over his emotions. However, when Brooke mentioned Shanghai and the fertility clinic, a specific memory crossed his mind with unexpected clarity. He recalled a time that had nearly lost its meaning on the surface, but now took on entirely new proportions. In his early 20s, Caleb had participated in an academic exchange program in Shanghai, part of a university partnership with an institution in the United States. His time in China lasted just over a semester, but it marked his journey in many ways. At the time, he was looking to expand his education, gain fluency in Mandarin, and mostly, escape the suffocating environment of the family business, which had been preparing him from a young age to take on responsibilities he didn't yet feel ready for. Within that context, amid the intense experience of the exchange, Caleb met people from all over the world, visited cultural spaces, got involved in research projects, and participated in a few student-led initiatives. Among those experiences, he volunteered for a university campaign encouraging anonymous sperm donation to local fertility banks. At the time, he didn't think deeply about the implications of his decision. He was young, idealistic in some ways, and saw the participation as a practical, almost altruistic gesture, driven by curiosity and a desire to do something useful with his free time. The procedures were technical, quick, bureaucratic. After the collection, he signed a standard form, was informed of the confidentiality of the data, and after that, never thought about it again. For years, that moment remained hidden, tucked into an irrelevant corner of his memory, with no emotional connection. Until now, Brooke's story rearranged the fragments of that memory like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. The city, the clinic, the timeline, it all matched the period he had spent there. And as he thought about the children's features, their expressions, their instinctive gestures, and the look in their eyes, Caleb realized he wasn't witnessing some random coincidence, but the direct result of a decision made long ago, during a time when life was still light and unburdened. The revelation didn't scare him. On the contrary, it brought a kind of unsettling relief, as if he could finally see beyond the rigid control he'd always exerted over his life. Those faces that had so disturbed him on the sidewalk now had a plausible explanation. The link was there, not through the direct story of a romance, but through an invisible connection forged by past choices. Caleb didn't feel guilt, nor regret, but he did realize that he couldn't ignore the reality that now stood before him with such force. His mind filled with images from the past, the university halls in Shanghai, debates with international classmates, lonely nights in cafes near the campus, and that brief form he had signed without imagining it would one day give rise to something so concrete, so alive. There was no way to undo what had happened, and in that moment, he didn't want to. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something slipping from his control, and strangely, it didn't paralyze him. He felt called to understand more, to be involved somehow, to know those children not just as shadows of a genetic past, but as presences now part of his present. The silence that overtook him wasn't empty. It was filled with a growing awareness that everything was changing, even without words. Life, once so predictable, now revealed itself to be larger than plans, more unpredictable than numbers, more real than the business strategies that had always guided his days. And although he didn't yet know what to do with all of it, he understood he couldn't turn his back on what fate, or chance, was now placing before him. The weight of the memory that had resurfaced in Caleb still hung heavy in his thoughts when, moved by a sense of coherence and responsibility, he decided not only to accept the revelation, but to act on it with firmness and calm. Knowing where the children came from wasn't enough. rationally understanding what linked him to them wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed to see them up close, hear their laughter, watch their movements, feel the real impact of what he had discovered. It was as if every detail of their routine represented a loose thread of his own existence, now accessible and, at the same time, fragile. And in the face of that, he couldn't simply retreat. He knew the opportunity to build bonds and understand the real scope of that connection required a deeper gesture, something that would break through the surface of coincidences and allow a new path, however uncertain, to begin taking shape. It was driven by this conviction that, without hesitation, he suggested to Brooke that she come with him to the family vineyard. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a way of showing willingness, of opening space for something he still didn't know how to name, but that was already changing him from within. The property, located just a few hours from Los Angeles, was in Napa Valley, a region that combined tradition and natural beauty, marked by gentle hills, vast vineyards, and a comforting silence that contrasted with the frantic rhythm of big cities. There, Caleb knew he could have time and privacy to observe, to think, to feel, and above all, to offer Brooke and the children a welcoming environment, far from urban chaos and external pressures. When Brooke heard the proposal, she plunged into an internal whirlwind. Even though she was emotionally exhausted, she recognized in Caleb's eyes a seriousness that went beyond curiosity or shock. There was a genuine willingness to understand, to embrace, perhaps even to make amends. It was hard to trust someone who, just hours earlier, had been a complete stranger, but at the same time, there was something in his behavior that didn't reflect the typical arrogance of powerful men. Caleb showed no superiority, no impatience, and didn't try to convince her with empty words. His gesture was direct, practical, but carried an intention that went beyond the immediate. That's why, after some thought, after weighing the risks and listening to her heart for what would be best for her children, she accepted the invitation. The decision wasn't impulsive, but born of an understanding that something greater was unfolding, something that needed space to reveal itself. The trip to the vineyard happened under a hush of contained silence. The children, unaware of the complexity of the situation, kept themselves entertained with small games and curious observations out the car window. Brooke remained attentive to every movement, protecting with her eyes and gestures the little world she had built with effort and love over all those years. Caleb, behind the wheel, alternated between discreet glances in the rearview mirror and moments of deep introspection. The route, surrounded by landscapes that gradually became greener and gentler, served as a kind of transition between two distinct realities. The old one, made of individual certainties and solitary routine, and the new one, marked by unexpected discoveries, unplanned bonds, and a growing sense of belonging he didn't yet fully understand. Upon arriving at the estate, the wrought iron gate opened slowly, revealing a path lined with tall cypress trees and neatly arranged grapevines. The main house of the vineyard, a spacious Tuscan-style structure, stood imposingly at the center of the property, with its wooden windows, balconies adorned with flowering vines, and a generous porch that invited rest. The place exuded peace and history, as if every stone carried memories from past generations. Brooke stepped out of the car cautiously, taking in the surroundings with attentive eyes, while the children immediately marveled at the wide open space, running across the lawn with the lightness typical of childhood. That setting, so far removed from the tight, simple life they knew in Los Angeles, felt like an unexpected dream. Caleb followed each step discreetly. He didn't impose, didn't try to control movements or dictate rules. He simply watched, silently, the effect that space had on Brooke and the children. And as he saw them there, settling so naturally into an environment that had, until then, served only as an occasional refuge for him, something inside him gently broke open. For the first time, he didn't see the vineyard as a symbol of tradition or family responsibility. He saw, instead, the possibility of a new beginning. Brooke walked slowly through the exterior corridors of the house, taking in the details with the sensitivity of someone who knows how to appreciate beauty without extravagance. Her eyes didn't seek luxury, but safety. Her hands protected her children, but also gently touched the objects she encountered along the way. She was a woman who knew struggle, but never let hardship erase her ability to feel. The stay, though brief in that initial moment, established a new realm of experience for everyone. Caleb began spending time with the children with a closeness he never imagined experiencing. The simple acts of listening to them, preparing meals with them, helping them find fruit in the vineyards, or teaching them to identify the aromas of wine in empty glasses represented for him an unexpected immersion into a reality he had never dreamed of building. Brooke, for her part, remained reserved, but gradually allowed her initial rigidity to give way to growing curiosity. Not about Caleb's life, but about what might emerge from such an unlikely meeting. With each gesture, she evaluated not only the man now approaching her children, but also the signs of a change that seemed authentic, even if unspoken. In that landscape marked by calm and the cycles of nature, the presence of the five, Brooke, Caleb, and the three girls and the boy, began to shape something new. It wasn't about fitting one another into predefined roles, but about recognizing in the other a possible extension of oneself. Brooke's past, marked by frustration and abandonment, was no longer a solitary burden. Caleb's past, once rigid and controlled, began to soften in the face of the spontaneity of those little beings now calling him by name so naturally. And so, without haste, without promises, but with delicate steadiness, the foundations of a new bond began to form there, among the grapevines, under the golden light of dusk, far from the world's gaze, with only the sound of wind blowing through the leaves. The days following Brooke and the children's arrival at the vineyard turned out to be more than just a simple adjustment in routine. While the welcoming environment of the estate eased the weight of uncertainty, the dynamics among everyone present began to take shape organically. Caleb, immersed in internal discoveries, maintained a calm posture, yet was clearly attentive to every detail involving those small faces now crossing his path with such spontaneity. Brooke, although still reserved, began walking with lighter steps through the halls of the house, realizing that time in that space didn't follow the rigidity of city clocks, but obeyed the natural rhythms of the land, the light, and the emotions held within. It was within this context of quiet transition that Walter, Caleb's grandfather, returned to the estate. Walter had always maintained a strong relationship with his grandson, marked more by restrained gestures than words. Since he was young, Caleb had seen in him a steady presence, the kind of man who carried in his eyes the memory of earlier times, but never allowed his spirit to grow old. His arrival at the vineyard that afternoon, under a clear sky and soft breeze, stirred neither alarm nor haste. He simply brought with him a calm that filled the spaces with meaning. Upon seeing his grandfather's car drive along the vineyard path leading to the house entrance, Caleb stepped out to greet him. He knew that this meeting carried different nuances, for now, for the first time, he would be presenting to the man he so admired something that defied all planning or logic, the possible existence of great-grandchildren who, without warning, had appeared in his life as reflections of his own blood. Walter stepped out of the car with the tranquility of someone who understands the value of pauses. His gaze first rested on Caleb, but soon turned to the four children playing in the garden, followed by Brooke, who watched over them with the delicacy of someone who understands both the lightness and the risks of childhood. The old man didn't show exaggerated surprise, nor did he rush to ask questions. Instead, he approached with a restrained but warm smile and allowed his presence to speak louder than any explanation. He observed the children's faces attentively, noting familiar features that stirred a quiet emotion in his chest. There was no judgment in him, only serene curiosity and immediate affection, as if the bond was recognized not by reason, but by the intuition of generations intertwining. The children, naturally open to Walter's gentle energy, approached him with the curiosity typical of their age. He crouched down with some difficulty, but without hesitation, extending his wrinkled hands with firmness and tenderness. The little ones gathered around him, sharing fragments of their games and proudly showing off small discoveries from the garden. Walter responded with smiles and approving gestures, allowing that new connection to form without formal explanations. From a distance, Brooke watched the scene with a mixture of relief and emotion. She hadn't expected hostility, but she also wasn't sure how she'd be received by someone so directly tied to Caleb's past. However, seeing Walter welcome the children so naturally, she understood that in that space, bonds could form without warning, guided solely by sensitivity. That same afternoon, the bond deepened. Walter walked the vineyard halls with the children, pointing out architectural details, recalling stories about the founding of the estate and showing them little corners of the property where time seemed to rest. Brooke, though still reserved, allowed herself moments of lighter observation, as if the grandfather's presence had dissolved part of the barriers she still held up. Caleb, meanwhile, stayed close, but respected everyone's space, feeling more like someone witnessing the formation of something new than the center of that universe. He had learned not to interfere with natural processes, and now realized that the most important relationships formed precisely when they weren't forced. Nightfall came slowly, tinting the sky with orange and golden hues, and the house filled with a serene silence, broken only by the children's laughter and the soft sounds of surrounding nature. Walter sat on the porch with one of the girls in his lap, while the others gathered around, listening closely to a story about his youth among the grape fields. The image of the old man surrounded by the little ones brought Caleb an unfamiliar sense of completeness, as if that unexpected piece of life made more sense than any past achievement. Brooke sat nearby, still alert, but with her shoulders less tense and her gaze softer. That night, no words were needed. The atmosphere spoke for everyone. From that meeting with Walter onward, the atmosphere at the vineyard shifted, not because of major revelations or final decisions, but because his presence brought a kind of quiet legitimacy to the coexistence that was taking shape. The days passed more lightly. Caleb divided his time between professional commitments and moments with the children. Walter stayed involved, offering stories, lessons, and a steady presence. Brooke gradually adjusted her habits to the new routine, finding her own rhythm within that setting that once seemed temporary, but now began to take on a sense of permanence. The home, once only a backdrop of inheritance and tradition for Caleb, became a stage for real encounters, with concrete affections and emotions in formation. After the first days at the vineyard, something began to change in a subtle way, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but intense for those living each moment up close. Caleb, who had always maintained a composed demeanor, surrounded by emotional protocols and well-defined limits, began to allow small cracks to form in the rigidity he had built so carefully over the years. The constant presence of the children, with their unfiltered lightness and unpredictable energy, created fissures in the walls he had erected around himself. At first, he only observed from a distance, maintaining some separation, but little by little, driven by the simple and spontaneous gestures of the children, he began to draw closer, cautiously. It was everyday actions that started this connection. One of the boys asked for help reaching a fruit in the orchard, and Caleb, without hesitation, lifted him onto his shoulders, feeling the light laughter vibrate beside his face. Another was curious about how the controls of the automated wine cellar worked, and Caleb explained patiently, noticing the boy's curious sparkle. One of the girls was enchanted by the horses on the property, and he accompanied her to the stables, showing her how to gently pet a horse's muzzle without startling it. These seemingly mundane moments triggered something deep, a bond that formed effortlessly, grounded simply in presence and the truth of those shared experiences. Brooke, who until then had watched Caleb's every move with a careful eye, observed this change with a mixture of surprise and relief. She realized that he wasn't just the reserved, methodical executive she had come to know. There was a buried humanity within him, repressed by choices, traumas, and obligations. The way he interacted with the children wasn't rehearsed or strategic. It was genuine. Every gesture, every quiet smile, every awkward attempt at playing or keeping up with a child's joke revealed that he not only accepted the children's presence, but genuinely wanted to understand them. And that, for Brooke, was a turning point. Her body relaxed. The tense expression gave way to gentler features. She began to walk more lightly, to smile more often, feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could build something different here than she had imagined. Walter, with his quiet wisdom, played a decisive role in cementing that atmosphere. He was always nearby, but never interfered. He gave Brooke and Caleb the space to find their own rhythm, offering only the steady foundation on which they could move. The children, feeling welcomed and free, created a routine full of discoveries and affection. They ran through the old halls of the house, explored the vineyards, helped with small tasks, and most of all, they found in Caleb a figure who, though still taking shape, already marked them with a firm and protective presence. The man who once avoided any emotional involvement now found himself looking for the children when he woke up, wondering where they were and what they were doing. He watched their play from a distance, and even when he didn't join in, kept a quiet smile on his lips. The nights on the porch, in silence beside Brooke, became frequent. They shared that time without words, yet with a growing sense of companionship. She would gaze at the stars or the subtle movements of the children inside the house. He, reflecting on everything that had changed since that improbable day when he spotted the 4 little ones crossing the street in downtown Los Angeles. This new dynamic brought everyone an unexpected sense of belonging. Brooke, who had once carried the weight of all responsibilities alone, could now share, at least in part, the care and the affection. Caleb, who had always believed there was no room for real emotional ties, discovered that there was joy in giving, even within his limitations. The children, in turn, blossomed. They were more secure, more joyful, more connected to their environment and to each other. Walter's steady presence, Brooke's balance, and Caleb's quiet effort created an emotional ecosystem where the pain of the past didn't disappear, but stopped dictating the steps of the present. And so, in that setting surrounded by vineyards, hills, and old memories, a new story began to take shape. There was no rush, no promises, just the natural rhythm of relationships rebuilding in everyday life. Caleb's emotional coldness, which for so long gave him control, was now giving way to more authentic gestures. It wasn't an abrupt transformation, but a careful dismantling. Brooke, witnessing this change, understood that not every bond has to begin with love at first sight. Some bonds form through coexistence, persistence, shared silence, and above all, through the courage to allow something new to emerge, even after so many scars. The serene environment of the vineyard, which had slowly become an unexpected refuge for Brooke and the children, was abruptly disrupted by the unexpected arrival of Savannah. The sound of tires on the gravel road preceded the strong presence of the woman who, for years, had orbited around Caleb's life like a constant shadow, sometimes subtle, other times dominating. Her posture as she exited the car already made it clear she hadn't come by chance or convenience. Her expression carried indignation, and her hurried steps left no doubt that something inside her was boiling. The sight of Brooke and the children on the property triggered in her a discomfort she didn't even try to hide. It wasn't just jealousy, but a deeper sense of threat, something she never imagined she would face so close to what she had always considered her emotional territory. Savannah crossed the garden with a haste that clashed with the tranquility of the place. The sound of her footsteps on the damp ground was absorbed by the main house, which had until then seemed to breathe at a slower pace. Upon entering, her eyes scanned every detail quickly, as if searching for visible proof of what she had already been told. The suitcases in the corner of the living room, the toys scattered near the sofa, the children's laughter echoing from afar, all served as a trigger for her unease. To her, the scene symbolized more than just a simple visit. It represented a rupture in the stability she believed she had with Caleb, even if that stability had never been officially cemented by stronger ties. Savannah had always been part of the family's landscape, familiar, accepted, and to some extent, settled into a role that never demanded clear definitions. Now, however, she felt her place was at risk. Brooke, noticing the unusual commotion, quickly sensed the tension settling in. She didn't need to hear words to understand that the woman who had just arrived was not a distant acquaintance or inconvenient relative. There was something in the way she looked around, in how she measured every detail of the space, that made it clear. That presence carried history, possessiveness, and resistance. The children, still unaware of the complexity unfolding, continued playing in the backyard, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the house. Walter, on the other hand, watched everything silently, observing from a distance with the wisdom of someone who had seen similar situations and knew the truth would reveal itself in everyone's behavior. Caleb arrived shortly after. The impact of the scene hit him hard. He saw Savannah in the middle of the living room, Brooke in the kitchen preparing snacks for the children, and Walter's gaze fixed on the window. The air was heavy. Though no one had said a word yet, the tension was palpable. He understood, without needing any explanation, that the moment called for decisions he had long postponed. It was no longer about balancing obligations with emotions. Now, a new reality stood before him. 4 children, a woman who demanded nothing but whose eyes said everything, and another who refused to lose what she believed was hers, by emotional or historical right. Savannah, with her imposing presence, represented the past still insisting on occupying space. Brooke, even in silence, represented the future taking shape without asking for permission. The tension of that day didn't explode in shouting or direct confrontation. The discomfort lingered in the air, in restrained gestures, in avoided glances, in doors that closed a little more forcefully than necessary. Caleb spent the rest of the day between practical decisions and internal reflection. He knew he couldn't avoid the confrontation much longer. Savannah's presence there, uninvited, was a clear attempt to reassert power, to stake her claim. And even though she had never been formally part of his life, she had always held some influence around him, especially with his family and their social circles. Yet at that moment, he realized with clarity that something had changed profoundly. The discomfort he felt at her arrival wasn't about being embarrassed in front of Brooke. It was the realization that Savannah no longer represented anything but an echo of what had once been convenient. As Savannah became increasingly unsettled, Brooke remained calm, focused on the children and the simple tasks of daily life. That calmness, even in the face of veiled hostility, was what most unsettled Savannah. She had expected resistance, justifications, maybe even guilt. But she found none of that. Brooke simply continued with her life in the vineyard, as if she already knew that her staying there didn't depend on disputes, but on the natural way everything had been unfolding. The children, even sensing something was different, remained joyful. They ran, drew pictures, told stories. The bond between them and Caleb grew stronger by the day, more and more evident, and it was this quiet strengthening that made Savannah feel increasingly out of place. The vineyard, once a place where Savannah moved freely, had now become a setting of transformations beyond her control. Walter, steady in his welcoming demeanor, treated Brooke with the same affection as always, refusing to yield to artificial tension. Caleb, in turn, was increasingly present, attentive to the children, to the house's routines, and to the small details he had never considered before. And Savannah, for the first time in a long while, had to face the possibility that she may never have held the place she believed was hers. In the days following Savannah's arrival, the atmosphere at the vineyard oscillated between apparent normality and a latent tension that lingered in every room like a cold draft. Despite everyone's effort to maintain the routine, it was impossible to ignore the unsettling presence of the woman who moved through the property with the conviction of someone who believed she was about to reclaim control over something she had long considered hers. Brooke remained firm, focused on the children, and on keeping her composure. Even as she noticed Savannah's hostile glances and gestures, she chose not to respond, sustaining her presence with dignity and silence. Caleb became more introspective. He began avoiding long conversations, as if needing time to process the internal conflicts growing with the forced cohabitation. Walter, attentive to it all, remained discreet, watching each movement with the calm of someone who knew that some truths imposed themselves without the need for intervention. It was on a cloudy morning, after a night of heavy rain, that Savannah decided to play her last card. During breakfast, while everyone was still scattered around the house, she appeared in the living room with a cold and determined expression. Her firm steps made it clear that what she was about to say was not open for discussion. She did not hesitate before announcing, with calculated coldness, that she was pregnant with Caleb's child. The revelation, delivered like a premeditated strike, was clearly intended to reverse the situation she found herself in. But it wasn't just the claim of pregnancy that caused widespread discomfort. It was the tone, the mechanical way in which she declared that because of this, the wedding between her and Caleb should be moved up. There was no room for doubt or dialogue. Her posture made it clear this was an imposition, not a request. And the silence that fell over the room after her words was more deafening than any impulsive reaction. The impact reverberated differently for everyone. Brooke, upon hearing it, felt as if the ground beneath her had briefly collapsed. Though she had no formal relationship with Caleb, there had been something between them, something sensitive and steadily growing, shaped by glances, gestures, and a quiet care that defied logical explanation. The possibility that he was truly involved with Savannah to that extent brought a mix of frustration, sadness, and helplessness. Yet, contrary to Savannah's expectations, Brooke didn't react with despair. Her instinct was to protect the children, maintain her composure, and withdraw, carrying herself with dignity in a silent gesture that spoke louder than words. Caleb, visibly shaken, showed no excitement at the news. His face remained expressionless, as if his body was present, but his mind needed more time to absorb the claim and everything it implied. Walter, sensing the shift and the rising tension, chose only to observe. With the experience of someone who had witnessed every kind of family conflict, he understood that it wasn't his place to interfere or take sides. He knew that any intervention in that moment would only heighten the emotions. The vineyard, which had become a place of healing and rebuilding for everyone, now found itself threatened by a narrative that didn't belong to the present, but insisted on forcing itself into it. Savannah, by declaring the pregnancy, aimed to seal a destiny, but failed to realize that time and feelings now followed a different rhythm. The bond Caleb had formed with the children and with Brooke was real, solid, and alive, unlike the empty formality that had always marked his connection with Savannah. In the days that followed, the atmosphere grew even heavier. Savannah began moving through the house with a forced confidence, trying to assert herself as the future wife and mother of the family heir. She took on roles she had never assumed, approached the staff with rehearsed cordiality, and attempted to involve herself in the vineyard's business, as if trying to secure her place on every front. But her actions fell flat. The looks she received were full of suspicion, not respect. Even the long-standing staff could see the artificiality in her presence. Meanwhile, Caleb remained distant, avoiding long conversations and spending more and more time with the children, as if in their company he could find the balance he desperately needed. And Brooke, though deeply affected, did not fall into drama. She remained strong, caring for the children with renewed attention, keeping her distance from Caleb, and avoiding any direct confrontation with Savannah. Her demeanor wasn't one of resignation, but of self-respect. The situation reached a point where everything seemed suspended. Decisions, feelings, bonds. Every gesture became loaded with hidden meaning. Savannah waited for reactions that never came. Brooke kept a silence that said everything. Caleb, torn between the pressure of a possible responsibility and the certainty of his feelings, wandered in circles within himself. The vineyard, a silent witness to it all, remained alive, with its aromas, sounds, and untouched scenery. But inside the house, time felt frozen. The pregnancy announcement, far from bringing clarity or unity, threw everyone into an even more uncertain territory. Savannah believed she had won, but the void between her and Caleb became more obvious with each passing day. Brooke, with her quiet presence, remained the most dignified figure there, and the children, innocent amid the chaos, continued to be the strongest link between two adults who still had to learn how to choose with their hearts. The already heavy atmosphere at the vineyard became even more intense in the mornings following Savannah's announcement. Her apparent certainty about the pregnancy clashed dramatically with the lack of evidence and the growing suspicion spreading through the house. Brooke, though shaken, maintained her composed posture, focusing her energy on the children and avoiding any direct confrontation. Caleb, increasingly withdrawn, showed signs of emotional exhaustion. The moments he once spent with the twins, marked by affection and discovery, now also became quiet retreats where he tried to make sense of the web of feelings and doubts surrounding him. Walter, as observant as ever, took everything in with the knowing eyes of someone who understood more than he let on. It was precisely because he could no longer stand to see the environment deteriorate that Walter decided to intervene. He didn't do so with drama, nor in a confrontational tone. His always measured and firm approach brought the truth to light with the authority of someone who knew the facts intimately. He chose the moment when Savannah, once again, tried to position herself as the central figure of the house, planning changes and suggesting decisions as if her place was already secured. Walter then, calmly, revealed a truth that had long been kept quiet. Caleb had suffered a motorcycle accident at the age of 30, a serious episode that resulted in permanent complications. Since then, he had faced a silent and painful reality: sterility. None of the doctors who treated him had left room for doubt. The diagnosis was final. The information, though delivered with restraint, hit everyone like a wave washing away sandcastles built on illusions. Savannah, upon hearing it, momentarily lost her composure. She tried to react, deny, and justify herself with evasions, but the impact of that undeniable truth was inescapable. Caleb remained still, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if that past, until then hidden out of shame or pain, had returned not only to expose a limitation, but to unmask a lie. Brooke, on the other hand, felt a quiet sense of relief, not because someone had been unmasked, but because she now knew that the bond between her and Caleb hadn't been destroyed by a third party's lie. Walter's revelation brought an end to the cruelest doubt and made room for truth to reclaim its place. The vineyard, which for so many years had held onto silences and memories, now echoed with the weight of an undeniable revelation. The staff, even those who had only witnessed the recent events from afar, sensed that something irreversible had shifted. Savannah, once proud and assertive, now avoided eye contact and moved through the house with an uneasiness she could no longer conceal. Her attempt to manipulate destiny, using a supposed pregnancy as a power play, dissolved under the weight of medical reality and Caleb's well-documented past, and Walter, in finally breaking his silence, had offered the family a protective gesture. He hadn't merely exposed the truth, he had restored the balance that had been eroded by intrigue and convenience. The revelation also stirred something inside Caleb. Confronting the memory of the accident, something he had kept locked away for so long, required more than courage. It meant diving into a pain that had shaped his way of relating to the world. Infertility, though always hidden, had been present in his decisions, his emotional distance, even in the rigid way he lived his life. But now, seeing the truth exposed, something inside him was set free. For the first time in years, he felt he no longer had to carry that burden alone. The presence of Brooke and the children, the simplicity with which they filled the space, stood in stark contrast to everything artificial Savannah represented. That difference was now clearer than ever. Savannah's attempt at manipulation didn't hold up against the truth, and although she remained on the property, it was clear her stay was temporary. The control she believed she had was gone. There was no more room for strategy, only for consequences. Brooke, in turn, began to see Caleb differently, not as the man who could provide security or comfort, but as someone who, despite being wounded, was still capable of opening himself to love, even if cautiously. And Caleb, looking at her, finally admitted what he had once feared. What he felt went beyond convention, beyond biological limitations, beyond the past. Walter, now silent once more, knew his role had been fulfilled. By revealing what he had kept hidden for so long, he had cleared the way for the real story to finally unfold, without masks. Walter's revelation triggered an inevitable upheaval, a silent earthquake that shook the foundations of everything Savannah had tried to build through manipulation. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the vineyard settled into a peculiar state of suspension, where every gesture and glance carried more weight than usual. Savannah, who had once moved with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the narrative, began to show signs of disorientation. The artificial glow of her presence began to dim, and the hard shell she used to uphold her lie began to crack in invisible places, like porcelain under constant pressure. Brooke maintained her discreet posture, avoiding any direct confrontation, but her calm radiated a strength that stood in stark contrast to Savannah's growing instability. Caleb, more introspective than ever, withdrew from any attempt at conversation, immersing himself in his routines with the children and the quiet tasks around the vineyard. Even in the face of the irrefutable truth about Caleb's sterility, Savannah continued to uphold the lie. She tried to manipulate the narrative, claiming she had hidden the pregnancy out of insecurity, out of fear of rejection, trying to flip the situation and elicit sympathy where there was no room left for leniency. She suggested confusion about dates, hinted at the possibility of diagnostic error, even insinuated a miraculous reversal of Caleb's medical condition. But the more she spoke, the weaker her argument became. With each excuse, her desperation became more apparent. Her eyes no longer held their former steadiness. Her once precise movements now wavered between hesitation and anger. The mask began to fall, not because of external pressure, but from the internal collapse of a lie she could no longer sustain. Walter's presence remained constant, but silent. He knew that once the truth had been revealed, there was no longer a need for direct confrontations. It was only a matter of time before Savannah, cornered by the evidence and by the indifference of everyone around her, would crumble under the weight of her own choices. And that's exactly what happened one stifling afternoon, as the sky threatened a storm that mirrored the turmoil building inside the house. Savannah, already on the brink of an emotional collapse, could no longer sustain the lie. Surrounded by silent and indifferent gazes, by the complete absence of support, and pressured by a silence that exposed her more than any verbal accusation, she broke. In a fit of rage mixed with desperation, she admitted that the child she claimed to be carrying was not Caleb's. The confession came with insults, accusations, and a desperate attempt to shift focus from her own responsibility. She said Caleb was always emotionally unavailable, that he never knew how to truly love, that he turned everything around him into distance and coldness. Her voice, once calculated and firm, now trembled between sobs and screams, revealing not just the lie, but the pain she carried, a pain that perhaps had nothing to do with Caleb, but everything to do with her own wounds, frustrations, and unresolved failures. She tried to blame him for her downfall, as if he owed her something he never promised. The scene, although intense, did not stir commotion. Brooke remained still, watching with the steady gaze of someone who already knew the colors of manipulation. Walter only sighed, like someone who had finally seen the last piece of a puzzle fall into place. And Caleb, in the end, stayed silent. His face expressed neither anger nor relief, only a deep weariness, as if in that moment he had closed a long and exhausting chapter of his life. Savannah, realizing she wouldn't create the impact she had hoped for, gathered her things in a hurry and left, leaving behind more than just lies. She walked away from the vineyard with her head down, surrounded by the same silence she once tried to dominate, but which now suffocated her. Her departure marked not a victory, but the raw evidence that her game had failed. Savannah's departure brought a sense of relief to everyone, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. The vineyard, quiet as it was, seemed to breathe more easily. The natural sounds, rustling leaves, birdsong, the soft wind among the vines, returned to fill the spaces once consumed by tension. Brooke resumed her routine with the children, no longer needing to measure each step, each glance. Her presence in the house became solidified not just by her staying there, but by the sincere affection she inspired in everyone. Caleb, still navigating his emotional reorganization, began to show more ease, as if Savannah's absence had cleared an internal path he could no longer ignore. And Walter, always observant, recognized in that moment a real chance for a fresh start. That cycle, so long marked by old wounds, wrong decisions, and painful silences, had finally come to an end. The space left by Savannah was not an emptiness, but an opportunity. The entire episode had shown everyone that attempts to control affection, to manipulate destiny with lies, will always fail in the face of the quiet truth of what is real. And what was real there, between Brooke, Caleb, the children, and even old Walter, was something no lie could erase. It was the slow, careful, and honest building of something that didn't yet have a definitive name but was already too solid to be destroyed by someone who only knew how to act out of self-interest. Savannah's departure sealed more than the end of an unwelcome presence. It also marked the beginning of a necessary silence, allowing everyone to reorganize their own emotions. The vineyard, now lighter, finally seemed to breathe naturally. Caleb resumed his routine with the twins, and Walter watched him with a look of pride and calm. Brooke, in turn, walked the grounds of the property with her children, as if absorbing the final moments of something that, though intense, she knew couldn't last indefinitely. The pastoral environment, the bonds formed, the small gestures exchanged between her and Caleb, all of it had grown deep roots in a short amount of time. Yet inside her, there was a responsibility that spoke louder, a clarity that prevented her from fully surrendering to what was blooming there. Brooke understood that the vineyard offered much more than shelter and tranquility. It offered, above all, an emotional refuge she hadn't experienced in years. However, she also knew that her time there had always had a limit. As enchanted as the children were, as peaceful as their days had become, she couldn't turn that pause into a new beginning without first resolving the more practical and profound aspects of her own life. She needed to resume her plans, provide stability for her children, and rebuild her own identity away from the impulse to rely on someone else. The decision to leave didn't come as a sudden rupture, but as a quiet, mature, and inevitable process. She packed her things without fuss, explained to the children that they would be going home, and kept on her face a serenity that masked the emotion she struggled to contain. Caleb noticed Brooke's movements with the sensitivity of someone who had learned to observe without needing words. He saw how she avoided lingering glances, how she packed the children's toys more slowly, how she took deep breaths before walking through each hallway. He understood, without her saying a word, that she was about to leave. The realization struck him like a silent blow, a sense of loss not accompanied by tragedy, but by a subtle and profound emptiness. During all the time she had been there, he had allowed himself a kind of emotional openness he once thought impossible. He had formed bonds with the twins that went beyond affection. There was a real connection, built day by day, nurtured by spontaneous gestures, sincere looks, and shared silences. And with Brooke, even though no promises had ever been made, something had taken shape, something rare and solid, a feeling that needed no definition, but which now threatened to slip through his fingers. He accompanied her final days, with a mix of restraint and intensity. He didn't stop her, didn't question her, nor did he try to persuade her. He simply respected her, perhaps because he understood that love, when real, isn't imposed, it's offered. And Brooke, even touched by the strength of that feeling, didn't want to stay as someone who depended, but as someone who chose. By deciding to leave, she wasn't rejecting Caleb. She was simply reaffirming the need to find her own center again, to not turn that love into a refuge or an escape. She needed to leave so that if a reunion ever happened, it would happen with both of them whole, conscious, and free from old wounds. The farewell was silent, free of drama, marked by long glances and embraces that spoke more than words ever could. The twins said goodbye to Walter with the spontaneous affection of those who already saw him as part of the family. Caleb stood strong, but inside, there was a growing restlessness, an urgency battling against his reason. As the car drove off down the road that cut through the vineyards, he stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. He felt something precious slipping away, not just Brooke and the children, but a real chance to build a new chapter away from the shadows of the past. That immediate absence echoed throughout the vineyard. The days felt longer, the spaces emptier. The memories of his final moments with Brooke pressed in, the twins' laughter in the hallways, her light footsteps in the mornings, the quiet glances exchanged at dinner. Everything was still there, imprinted in every corner, but now tinged with the ache of longing. Caleb, no matter how much he tried to focus on daily tasks, knew something inside him had changed irreversibly. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield now suffocated him. Brooke's absence wasn't just physical distance. It was the rupture of a connection that had taught him about presence, care, and possibility. Walter, always observant, watched his grandson with discretion. He knew that this temporary loss carried more meaning than Caleb was willing to admit. It wasn't just a woman and 2 children who had left. It was the chance for a new beginning, for a kind of love built on truth, and one that might not return if not pursued. The old man, with the wisdom of someone who knew the cost of silence, waited for time to bring clarity. Caleb, in turn, felt he could no longer ignore the urgency rising in his chest. He had respected Brooke's decision, as he needed to, but he also knew that sometimes respecting didn't mean accepting loss as final, and that love, when true, demanded more than contemplation. It demanded action. Brooke and the twins' absence began to mark Caleb's days with a clarity he hadn't anticipated. Though he kept to his routine with discipline, his mind kept circling back to the moments they had shared, the simple gestures that now felt essential. He realized that it wasn't just longing he was feeling. It was, above all, a real void, a tangible absence that pierced through the most ordinary moments. Breakfast without the children's laughter, walking through the now silent hallways, looking out at the vines that seemed less alive without Brooke's presence. That time together had changed his view of the world, and especially of himself. He felt that the coldness he had always used as protection could no longer sustain him. It now felt like an old, worn-out veil that no longer fit the man he was becoming. Walter, always present and attuned, didn't need many words to show support for his grandson's restlessness. In a quiet gesture, he left a piece of paper on Caleb's desk. It had the address of the school where Brooke worked. That was all it took. Caleb understood it was time to act. There was no room for hesitation. The truth inside him was clear. He wanted Brooke in his life, not as someone who passed through it, but as someone he could walk beside. And the twins, with their spontaneity, had awakened something in him he never thought possible. The the genuine desire to build a family, not out of convenience, obligation, or appearance, but out of choice, out of love. With the address in hand and his heart unsettled, Caleb left the vineyard. The drive to Los Angeles was quiet, accompanied only by his thoughts. With every mile traveled, the weight of the decision grew, not as a burden, but as a responsibility he embraced with maturity. He arrived at the school on an ordinary day. No warning, no expectation of a grand gesture, just the certainty of what he needed to do. The school environment, filled with children's voices, colorful posters, and constant motion, contrasted sharply with the world Caleb knew. But he wasn't intimidated. He looked for Brooke with the calm of someone who knows they're exactly where they should be. When he saw her, he felt the immediate impact of the presence he had missed so deeply. Brooke was surrounded by children, gently and firmly guiding an activity. The way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she watched the kids, it all confirmed what he already knew. She was extraordinary, and it was with her that he wanted to share his life. Without rehearsed speeches or grand promises, Caleb approached, and in front of everyone, declared honestly that he was there because he had realized something essential, that love cannot be imposed, but it also should not be abandoned. He said that it didn't matter what had come before, the past pain, the overcome bitterness, the fears. He wanted to build something real by her side, and with her children, if she allowed, not out of obligation, but by choice, not on impulse, but with conviction. The declaration, made without embellishment, struck Brooke like a breath of truth. She looked at him with eyes that held surprise and tenderness. The same feeling lived within her, though protected by layers of caution. And in that moment, faced with Caleb's sincere vulnerability, she realized she didn't need to defend herself anymore. What he was saying came from a real place, not from a passing desire. It came from someone who had changed, who had faced himself and overcome the fear of loving. Brooke took a deep breath, and even without words, her expression said it all. She accepted his presence in her life, but made it clear in every gesture that it wasn't a thoughtless surrender. It would be a path built slowly, with patience, care, and truth. From that moment on, something shifted between them. There were no more doubts, only the decision to walk together slowly, respecting each other's pace, differences, and individual stories that had brought them to that point. Caleb began visiting Brooke and the twins frequently, integrating himself into their home life naturally, never intruding, only adding. Over time, their bonds grew even stronger. The boys welcomed him with genuine enthusiasm, and Brooke gradually allowed herself to show affection more freely. Their visits became not just anticipated, but necessary. And Caleb, now lighter and more whole, revealed the man who had always been there behind the walls he'd built. The city, with its rhythm so different from the vineyard, didn't strip away the essence he had discovered in himself. On the contrary, it was in this new context that he learned to adapt his gestures, to balance his presence between the desire to protect and the need to give space. Brooke, in turn, felt safe beside him, not because he promised to solve everything, but because for the first time, she didn't have to face everything alone. It was a mutual construction, where every step respected each other's time and boundaries. And there, between schoolwork, simple dinners, and weekends in the park, a family was forming, different from convention, but profoundly true. A family not born by chance, but by choice, and most of all, by love. Time moved forward with the serenity that only accompanies stories whose essence is anchored in truth. After the decision to begin again together, Brooke and Caleb continued cultivating their relationship with an almost handcrafted care, respecting the details, the silences, and the ordinary days that form the foundation of any lasting love. There was no rush. Each shared moment solidified the space they occupied in each other's lives. Caleb's visits became frequent, until naturally, they began sharing the same days, the same meals, and little by little, the same dreams. Both of their pasts remained present, but no longer dictated the pace. They were simply the background of a story being rebuilt through conscious choices and a surrender born from the emotional maturity of two adults who had already faced their own abysses. In the months following that reunion in Los Angeles, Brooke allowed herself to trust, first in Caleb, then in herself, and finally in the idea that it was possible to live a life where love didn't mean dependency, and surrender didn't come with pain. The twins grew up surrounded by affection and stability, and it didn't take long before they started calling the vineyard their second home. Sienna, with her observant nature, found in Caleb a safe harbor, someone who listened even when she said nothing. Haley, more outgoing, would throw herself into his arms with the confidence of someone who knew she would always be caught. And Caleb, who had once seen himself as a man shaped by solitude, could no longer imagine life without those children who called out to him naturally, who sought his eyes like one seeks direction. Brooke adapted to the routine of balancing school and weekends at the vineyard with a lightness that even surprised her. She learned to slow down when surrounded by the vineyards, where time seemed to move differently. The vineyard, once a symbol of Caleb's family obligations, had now become a refuge of affection, laughter, and renewed roots. There, amid the scent of damp earth and the sound of birds at dawn, she rediscovered parts of herself she thought had been lost. The woman who believed in love, in building authentic bonds, in the strength of simple living. As the months passed, Caleb and Brooke felt no need to formalize their love with papers or ceremonies. What they shared didn't need to be translated into conventions. The constant presence, mutual care, shared plans, and the way they faced the unexpected together said everything. They were united, not by external obligations, but by the inner certainty that they belonged to one another. On that specific late afternoon, months after they had chosen to live as a family, the vineyards reflected golden hues under the setting sun. The clear sky contrasted with the green leaves of the vines, and a gentle breeze played with Brooke's hair as she watched the children run through the grape rows. Haley and Sienna played hide-and-seek with Logan and Caleb Jr., mixing laughter and excited shouts that echoed across the open field. Caleb, barefoot on the grass, carried a basket of fruit and watched the group with a calm gaze, laughing softly when the youngest tripped in his hurry and got up laughing before anyone could help him. That scene wasn't staged or marked by any special occasion. It was just life unfolding at the gentle rhythm of a family that had found its place in the world. Brooke approached Caleb with a subtle smile, the kind that reveals more than words. He casually slipped his arm around her shoulders, like someone who already knows the perfect way to fit two bodies deeply familiar with each other. There, under the twilight glow, there were no solemn promises or loud declarations, only the quiet certainty that everything they had faced had brought them there for a reason. Walter, sitting in his wooden chair near the old oak tree, watched the scene with teary eyes. He didn't need to say anything. He saw in his grandson's expression a peace he had never witnessed before, and in Brooke, he saw a woman whose presence had brought not just joy, but also redemption to that place. The children ran around him, and he smiled, smoothing his cane and murmuring softly to himself, as if thanking time for allowing him to witness that new chapter. The past, with all its pain, no longer occupied the center of the story. It still existed, of course, but now served only as a reminder of where they had all started, and how far they had come. There was no wedding with rings exchanged in front of guests, but there was something far more solid and profound. The daily choice to stay, to care, to grow together. That family was built on improbable meetings, on bonds forged through shared living, listening, and sincere affection. It didn't matter what the documents said, what traditions validated, or what outsiders expected. To them, it was clear. They were a family, and the love that united them didn't depend on blood or last names. It was woven in gestures, built in every shared meal, in every bedtime story, in every night. Brooke held Caleb's hand before turning out the light. On that evening, the children's laughter blended with the gentle sound of the wind rustling the leaves, and life seemed, for a moment, suspended in time. Brooke looked to the horizon with the peace of someone who could finally breathe without fear. Caleb looked at her from the side, and without a word she knew. They were exactly where they were meant to be. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, lighter, fuller, more complete. And in that vineyard, where so many stories had intertwined, a new one was being written, not by chance but by choice. And there, among the vines, the footsteps of 6 people moved toward the future with the steadiness of those who know that love, when real, needs no labels, only presence.